Imagine you're at a big family dinner and everything is pretty normal. People are chatting, passing food, and laughing. Then someone who almost never says a single harsh word about anyone suddenly speaks up. The whole room goes dead quiet and you can hear a pin drop. That's exactly what happened in Britain, except it wasn't a family dinner. It was a quiet charity event, and the person who spoke was Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. She's always been seen as the royal family's secret weapon because she's so good at staying calm and never causing drama. But then, she said something that wasn't even mean or loud, but it hit like a thunderbolt. It was about Meghan Markle, and it made everyone, from Buckingham Palace to California, completely freeze. People are still trying to figure out why she chose that exact moment to finally break her silence. There are some moments in life when someone says a few words, and you just know things will never be the same. It's not because they cursed or screamed. It's not because they told a big secret or made a wild accusation. It's because they chose their words so carefully and aimed them so perfectly that everyone who heard them knew exactly what they meant. That's what happened in the spring of 2026. And the person who did it wasn't a famous journalist, a loud politician, or someone trying to sell a book. It was Sophie, a woman who is usually so quiet and careful that people almost forget she's there. But on that day, she said something that stopped the whole country in its tracks and changed how people see the royal family. To really understand why her words caused such a shock, you have to know what was happening at the time. Sophie was at a private charity lunch in London, an event for a foundation she has worked with for years. It was all about women's health and helping communities. This wasn't a fancy party with cameras and red carpets. There were no reporters invited, and no one expected any big news to come out of it. It was just a small, quiet gathering of people who support the same cause. But you know how it is these days. Someone in the crowd had a phone. They secretly recorded what Sophie said, cut it into a short clip, and posted it online. By the next morning, millions of people had seen it. By the afternoon, it was on every news channel in Britain. And by the evening, the story had crossed the ocean and was all over American entertainment news. So, what exactly did Sophie say that caused this huge reaction? She was talking about how women should support each other in public life. She said that the women she admires most are the ones who really live their values, not just the ones who look good on TV while talking about them. She explained that the worst thing someone can do to a good cause is to attach themselves to it loudly and visibly, but then do almost nothing to help behind the scenes. Then, very calmly, she added that she had watched this kind of behavior up close and that it had hurt real people. She didn't say Meghan's name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about because the words fit so perfectly. It was like she had written a description that could only point to one person. The reaction in Britain was huge and immediate. People on social media split into two groups. One side said Sophie was finally telling the truth, and it was about time someone said it. They felt she was brave for speaking up because she was in a perfect position to know the facts. The other side was angry. They said this was a planned attack by the palace on Meghan, a woman who had already left the royal family and was trying to build a new life. Even though they disagreed on everything else, both sides agreed on one big thing. This was no accident. Sophie doesn't make mistakes like that. She knew exactly what she was doing and exactly what would happen when she said those words. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just what she said, but who said it. Sophie is not a royal who talks without thinking. She learned that lesson the hard way a long time ago. Back in 2001, a reporter tricked her into saying some embarrassing things about politicians, and those recordings were published in the tabloids. It was a huge scandal, and she almost lost everything, even her marriage and her place in the royal family. That experience changed her completely. Over the next 20 years, she became one of the most careful and disciplined members of the entire royal family. She always says what she means, but she's super careful about how she says it. She almost never says anything that could cause trouble. That's exactly why her words at that lunch in March hit so hard. Everyone knows she doesn't just blurt things out. If she said it, she meant it, and she had been thinking about it for a long time. People who know Sophie well all said the same thing when the recording came out. She knew what she was saying. She knew how people would react. And she said it anyway. That's what made everyone in Britain ask the same question over and over. Why now? What had happened to finally push this super controlled woman to make such a public and pointed statement? The answer to that question isn't just about the words themselves. It's about Sophie's whole life story, the history she carries, and all the stress that had been building up inside the royal family for months. What she said wasn't the start of this story. It was the moment when a much longer and more complicated story finally became too big to stay hidden. Let's go back to the beginning to understand why her words carried so much weight. Not to the polished, confident Duchess we see today, but to the young woman who first joined the royal family in the 1990s with almost no idea what she was getting into. Sophie Rhys-Jones was working in public relations when she met Prince Edward in 1993. She was confident and good with people, but she knew nothing about the strict rules and pressure of royal life. They dated quietly for a few years before getting engaged in 1999. Britain really liked her. She seemed genuine, like a regular person. She smiled naturally, didn't use a script, and seemed very real. But then 2001 happened, and everything changed. A journalist from a tabloid newspaper tricked her, pretending to be a potential client for her PR business. In their recorded conversations, Sophie made some very honest and unguarded comments about politicians, the royal family, and other famous people. When those recordings came out, the palace was furious. Her husband Edward was heartbroken. Sophie had to apologize publicly and basically quit her career. But what happened after that crisis is the part of Sophie's story that most people forget. Instead of fading away or just becoming a sad background figure, she did something much harder. She completely rebuilt herself from the inside out. She gave up her old career, focused all her energy on royal duties and charity work, and started doing the kind of patient and unglamorous service that doesn't get much media attention. Over the next 2 decades, she built a real record of genuine commitment to tough causes. She did a lot of work to prevent sexual violence in war zones. She traveled to some of the most dangerous places in the world to meet survivors in person. She didn't send a spokesperson or make announcements from a safe distance. She went herself again and again, without inviting cameras or making a big show of it. The difference between how she approached public service and how Meghan Markle did was something people inside the palace had been talking about privately for years. They never said it out loud to reporters, but they all noticed it. Sophie represents one way of being a royal, which is deep, personal, and often boring work that doesn't get much fame. Meghan, at least from the palace's point of view, represented the opposite, which was attaching herself to big, popular causes that got lots of attention, but without the same long-term personal effort. That comparison is super important because it explains the specific words Sophie used at the lunch. The phrase about performing a cause instead of living, it wasn't just a random thing she said. It came from her own life. She had spent 20 years actually living her causes, doing hard work in terrible conditions where nobody was filming or applauding. She sat with women in the Democratic Republic of Congo who had survived terrible things. She did that work without a Netflix deal, a podcast, or a lifestyle brand. When she talked about watching someone perform a cause up close and seeing it hurt people, she was talking about something she had really seen. The harm she mentioned is worth looking at closely because it's a part of the story that hasn't gotten much serious attention. Sources close to the royal family have said that the period between 2019 and 2022 was one of the most damaging times in the institution's recent history. And it wasn't just because of what Harry and Meghan said publicly after they left. It was because their departure itself broke up working relationships and personal bonds inside the family. People who had spent years building charitable programs together found themselves being pulled into a public fight. The causes they all worked on became tied to either Harry and Meghan or the royal family. Nobody inside the palace had asked for that drama, but they were all stuck in the middle of it. Sophie watched all of this happen from the center. She is married to Edward, one of the quietest royals. She never looked for fights or controversy. But she saw everything. She saw the damage the departure caused to the people who stayed. She saw charitable work get messed up. She saw the public get a wrong idea about what the royal family really does. And for years, she stayed quiet. That's the part that matters most when you're trying to understand why she finally spoke up in March 2026. Sophie doesn't make decisions on a whim. The 2001 crisis cured her of that forever. Every big choice she has made in the 25 years since has been thought through carefully, with a clear understanding of what might happen. So when she stood up at that lunch and said what she said, she had already accepted that it would spread far beyond that room. She had already decided that staying silent was costing too much. What pushed her to that point in early 2026 had to do with things happening on both sides of the Atlantic. On one side, the royal family was still dealing with the fallout from Prince Andrew's scandal and the public pressure for more accountability. On the other side, Meghan Markle was expanding her public profile in California in a way that the palace found both exhausting and genuinely upsetting. The specific thing that sources say was the final trigger for Sophie was a series of public statements Meghan made in February 2026. In these statements, Meghan talked about her own experiences inside the royal family and connected them to bigger conversations about racism and how women in power are treated. The statements were careful and got lots of media coverage. But in the view of people who were actually there for the events Meghan was describing, they were selective and sometimes just wrong. Sophie heard those statements. She thought about them for a few weeks. Then she went to that charity lunch and said her piece. The woman behind those words wasn't acting out of jealousy or personal rivalry. She was someone who had spent 25 years learning the difference between saying something because it feels good and saying something because it needs to be said. She reached a conclusion and acted on it with the same calm purpose she's had since 2001. The big question after Britain had absorbed the shock of her remarks was what was happening in California. Because Meghan's world in the days leading up to Sophie's comments was already under a lot of pressure, and her polished public image was more fragile than it looked. Let's paint a picture of the scene in Montecito at the end of March 2026. There's a huge, carefully built PR operation there. Its job is to make Meghan Markle look like one of the most influential and believable voices in the world on women's issues, social change, and progressive values. There's a lifestyle brand that had been getting some business traction. There's a podcast that had come back after a break and was getting good numbers. There's a social media presence that had been rebuilt with great care. From the outside, everything seemed to be going perfectly. But from the inside, according to people familiar with the operation, things were much more complicated. The months leading up to March 2026 had been tough for Meghan's team in ways that hadn't become public yet. The lifestyle brand, American Riviera Orchard, was growing slower than the big launch suggested. Some products that were announced with a lot of excitement hadn't hit the market on time. Retail deals that seemed to be almost done had stalled. The gap between the public show of momentum and the private reality of where things stood was getting bigger. The podcast was doing better. Its return had gotten real attention, and the early episodes had strong numbers. But keeping that attention meant constantly putting out content that was both personal and safe, which is harder than it sounds. Meghan's team was walking a tightrope, trying to keep people interested without giving anyone new material to use against her. Then Sophie's remarks went viral, and everything that was already hard became much harder overnight. The first response from Meghan's inner circle wasn't panic in a dramatic way. It was more like the kind of tense alertness that a well-drilled communications team gets when something happens that wasn't in any of their plans. Phones were ringing from early morning. A crisis meeting happened within hours of the story breaking in Britain. The main question they were asking was what Sophie had said. Everyone knew that. The question was how much of the British public would believe it, and how fast the story would spread in the American media in a way that could hurt the brand Meghan had spent years building. The answer came faster than they hoped. By the afternoon of the day, the story broke in Britain. American entertainment and culture sites had picked it up. By the next morning, the story was taking a shape that Meghan's team definitely didn't want. The main narrative wasn't about royal politics or power struggles. It was about authenticity. It was about whether Meghan's advocacy work was genuine. It was about whether a woman who claimed to be so honest was being called out by someone who had firsthand knowledge of how she actually operated. That angle was damaging in a specific, targeted way because authenticity is the very foundation of Meghan's whole public image. Everything she has built since leaving royal duties, the interviews, the documentary, the podcast, the advocacy, the lifestyle brand, it all depends on one main idea. She is someone who chose truth over comfort. She walked away from an institution that wanted her to stay quiet, and now she speaks with a freedom and honesty that the palace denied her. Sophie's words directly attacked that foundation. The phrase about performing a cause instead of living it was quoted over and over. It was used in headlines. It became the quick way to talk about the whole situation. And because it was so precise, and because it specifically targeted the gap between looking good and actually doing good, it was almost impossible for Meghan's team to fight back without giving it even more attention. So they made a decision not to respond right away, at least not officially. Sources say several draft responses were written and reviewed in the days after the story broke. None of them were released. The thinking was that any direct response would keep the story going and create a second wave of coverage about Meghan's reaction instead of the original remarks. Silence, they thought, was safer. But silence created its own problem. Because with no response from Meghan's team, the media space was filled by commentators, royal experts, former palace staff, and a steady stream of British voices who had been waiting for exactly this opening. And most of that commentary was not on Meghan's side. Britain, which had watched Sophie's remarks with a kind of quiet satisfaction that crossed usual political lines, was not in a generous mood. The impact on Meghan personally, as opposed to the impact on her brand, is harder to document but really important to understand. People who have talked to those close to her describe someone who was genuinely hurt by Sophie's words in a way that went beyond business worries. The reason is specific. Sophie is not one of the royals that Meghan has publicly made into an enemy. In all of Meghan's stories about her time in the family, Sophie was usually just in the background, never attacked or defended. She just wasn't a main character in the drama. That's why Sophie's decision to speak up, and to speak so precisely, stung in a special way. It wasn't the expected attack from an expected direction. It came from someone Meghan had essentially left alone, someone who had no obvious personal reason for conflict, someone whose reputation for honesty and genuine service made her words much harder to dismiss than criticism from people whose own credibility could be questioned. Harry's reaction added another layer of stress. Sources describe him as deeply uncomfortable with the attention the story got, though for reasons that weren't the same as Meghan's. Harry has been dealing with his own complicated feelings about the institution he left and the family members who stayed. Sophie and Edward have always kept a quieter distance from the Sussex situation than some other family members. For Harry, Sophie's public remarks felt like a door closing that he might have still hoped was open. The communication between Harry and Meghan during the days when the story was at its peak is described as tense, not in a way that suggested a big fight, but in the way that pressure shows the cracks in any relationship. They were dealing with the same crisis, but from slightly different places and with different worries. Meghan was focused on the brand and the American audience. Harry was dealing with something more personal. Trying to manage both sets of concerns at the same time, with no solution in sight, was very hard. By the end of the first week after Sophie's remarks went viral, Meghan's team had settled on a plan of careful redirection. They pushed new content across her social media channels. They moved up a podcast episode that was scheduled for later. They released photos of her working with a community group in California. The goal was to shift the conversation and give journalists something new to talk about, instead of continuing to spread Sophie's words. The plan worked a little. The immediate intensity of the coverage started to fade after about 10 days. But the underlying damage, the question Sophie had planted in people's minds about whether Meghan's advocacy was real, didn't disappear with the news cycle. It settled into the longer conversation about who Meghan Markle really is, beneath the careful public image. And that conversation, once it's really started, is not easy to stop. What the panic inside Meghan's operation ultimately showed was something that the smooth surface of her brand had been working hard to hide. The foundation is less stable than it looks. The business is less advanced than the announcement suggested. The American audience she has been trying to win over is more sensitive to questions about authenticity than her team had counted on. And the distance between California and London, which had felt like a shield protecting Meghan from the daily pressures of royal life and British public opinion, turned out to be much less protection than anyone thought. Sophie had spoken, Britain had listened, and in Montecito, the consequences of both of those facts were still being felt when an even bigger question began to emerge. What did Sophie's words say about the direction the royal family was going? And what did that mean for any remaining chance of reconciliation, which Harry at least was still quietly hoping for? That question leads to the final and maybe most important part of this story. What this moment shows about the royal family and what happens next. If you pull back from the immediate noise of the story, something bigger comes into view. Sophie's words weren't just a random moment of frustration that slipped out in public. They were a signal. And signals from inside the royal family, especially from someone with Sophie's discipline and track record, are rarely accidents and never without meaning. To understand what this signal means, you have to look at the bigger picture of the institution in the spring of 2026. And you have to ask a question that most royal news coverage avoids. What does the palace actually want the public to know about where things stand with Harry and Meghan right now? The answer that Sophie's remarks suggest is uncomfortable but important. The palace wants the public to know that the period of careful neutrality is over. For several years after Harry and Meghan left royal duties in 2020, the institution kept a deliberate silence on almost everything about the couple. Individual royals didn't comment. Official spokespeople dodged questions. The strategy was one of careful distance, neither supporting nor attacking, letting the couple build their new life in America while the family got on with the business of the monarchy without them. That strategy had costs. It meant taking a series of public punches, like the Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, and Harry's book, without putting up any visible defense. But the thinking was that fighting back would just make things worse. Something has shifted, and Sophie's words are the clearest public evidence that the calculation inside the palace has changed. The shift didn't happen overnight. It has been building through a series of events over the previous year that seemed separate, but actually point in the same direction. William is taking on more visible authority inside the institution. Charles's health is getting worse, which means real decision-making power is moving to the next generation faster than expected. The Andrew crisis is still putting pressure on the monarchy to show that it can be accountable and reform itself. All of these things have created an environment where the old strategy of quiet silence no longer works. William, who is now the main force shaping how the monarchy presents itself, has a very different view of how to handle the Sussex situation than the approach that marked the earlier years of his father's reign. People close to him describe someone who has run out of patience with a posture that he believes has let a damaging and dishonest story about the royal family go unchallenged for too long. He's not interested in public fights or tabloid wars, but he is interested in the truth. And he has, according to those who know him, been quietly encouraging those around him to stop treating silence as the only option. Sophie heard that encouragement and acted on it in the way that fits her character best. Not with a dramatic TV interview or a leak to a friendly reporter, but with a few precise sentences in a room she knew wasn't completely private, spoken in a tone so calm that nobody could accuse her of losing control. The specific timing of her remarks in relation to Meghan's February 2026 statements about racism and the treatment of women deserves a close look because the order of events matters. Meghan spoke in February. Sophie responded in March. That isn't a coincidence. Sources say Meghan's February statements were received inside the palace with a level of anger that surprised even those who thought they had already seen the worst of the Sussex drama. The specific claims she made, and how she framed them to connect her personal experience to bigger social and political issues, were seen as a deliberate move to get American media attention at a time when the palace was already dealing with multiple crises. The feeling inside the institution was that a line had been crossed, not for the first time, but in a way that felt different from before. And the response, when it came in Sophie's voice. What does this mean for any remaining possibility of reconciliation between Harry and the family he left? That question is at the center of everything that follows from this moment. The honest answer, based on what sources are saying about the current state of relationships inside the palace, is that the window isn't completely closed, but it's much smaller than it was a year ago. Harry's situation is genuinely complex and genuinely sad in ways that the public story rarely captures correctly. He is a man who made a series of decisions that he thought at the time were necessary for his own survival and his family's well-being. Some of those decisions he probably still stands behind. Others, according to people who have talked to those close to him, he now views with much more mixed feelings than he has publicly admitted. The memoir, in particular, is something Harry has struggled with privately. The specific things it said about family members, the conversations it revealed, and the way it painted people he grew up with and still loves, sits uneasily with him. His relationship with William is the one that matters most and the one that is most broken. They haven't had a real private conversation, according to sources, since the period around the late Queen's death in 2022. Their interactions since then have been formal, short, and managed through other people. There's no active hatred between them. Sources agree on that, but there is something in some ways harder to fix than hatred. There is a settled distance, a shared understanding that the trust which once existed is gone, and rebuilding it would require a level of honesty and vulnerability from both sides that neither is currently able to offer. Sophie's remarks and the way they were received make that distance wider because they show the family speaking with one voice. Not through William, whose complicated feelings about Harry are well known, but through Sophie, whose reputation for fairness and genuine integrity means her words carry a weight that William's never quite could on this subject. For Meghan, the effects are different and in some ways more important right now. The question Sophie raised about the authenticity of her advocacy work has a direct effect on the business and professional future she is building in California. That future depends on deals, investments, and on brands and audiences wanting to work with her as a believable voice on the causes she supports. Credibility, once it is genuinely questioned by a source that can't be easily dismissed, doesn't just bounce back on its own. It takes a constant, long-term effort to prove the exact kind of substance that Sophie said was missing. The challenge Meghan faces is that the most obvious way to show that substance, through deep, unglamorous commitment to causes that don't give you much personal attention, is almost completely opposite to the public brand she has spent years building. Her brand needs visibility. It needs the high-profile connection to causes that Sophie specifically pointed out as the problem. Changing that whole structure would mean rebuilding almost everything from the ground up. Keeping it the same means staying open to exactly the criticism Sophie made. There's no easy answer for her. And that might be the biggest result of what happened in that London lunchroom in March 2026. Look at the whole picture of what this moment means for the royal family itself, and something truly important comes into focus. The institution is in the middle of a generational change that is reshaping not just who holds power, but how that power is used and talked about. William's monarchy, when it arrives, will be defined by a set of values that are a direct and deliberate contrast to some of the patterns of his father's generation. Accountability over secrecy, substance over show, earned respect over assumed privilege. These are values that Sophie has lived for 25 years. Her willingness to speak plainly about performing a cause instead of living one is not just a comment about Meghan. It is a statement about what the institution now considers important. It signals more clearly than any official announcement that the people shaping the monarchy's future have decided that some things are worth saying, even when saying them is hard. Charles is still king, and the formal structures of the institution are still in place, but the moral center of gravity has moved. It sits now with William and with the people around him who share his vision for what the monarchy should be. Sophie is one of those people. Edward, quietly and consistently, is another. The generation that is taking over is not a generation that plans to handle its problems through silence and careful distance. It is a generation that has decided, with the specific patience of people who have waited a very long time to be in a position to decide anything, that honesty is not a weakness. What happens next in the Sussex story is still genuinely uncertain. Harry's situation will keep changing as his father's health does. The question of whether he returns to Britain for any formal event tied to the monarchy remains open and is talked about with anxiety on both sides. Meghan's professional path will depend on how well her team can manage the damage Sophie's words have done to her credibility. But one thing is no longer uncertain. The palace has found its voice on this subject. It found it in a room in central London, spoken in the measured tones of a woman who spent 25 years learning exactly when to speak and exactly what to say. Sophie said what needed to be said. Britain heard it, and the conversation that follows from that moment will shape the relationship between the Sussexes and the crown for years to come. The only question left is whether anyone in Montecito is truly listening. Sophie said what the palace had been thinking for years. She said it calmly, precisely, and without apology. The royal family is no longer managing this story quietly. It is shaping it deliberately. This conversation is far from finished.